June 18, 1944, Philippine Sea, Western Pacific. The night was a black ocean, endless and silent. The only light came from the dull red glow of instruments aboard the USS Lexington, CV-16. Deep inside her Combat Information Center, the CIC, sailors hunched over green screens that flickered like ghosts in the dark. Radar contact, bearing 075. Distance 220 miles, reported Ensign Robert McCauley, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. The faint blip pulsed rhythmically on the SG surface search radar, cutting through the static. Captain Felix Stump, commander of Task Group 58.2, leaned over the scope. 200 miles? That's beyond visual range. Yes, sir, McCauley replied. Multiple returns. Large formation. The captain exhaled slowly. Then they're coming. Just like we expected. Outside, the night wind howled over the carrier deck. Radar operators across the fleet were seeing the same thing. Faint echoes spreading across their cathode tubes like ripples in the sea. The Japanese had launched their strike. And they didn't know they were already seen. For years, Imperial Japanese Navy officers had mocked the Allies' reliance on radar. They called it electric magic, a gadget for engineers, not warriors. Real men, they said, trusted their eyes, their instincts, and the sky itself. But radar didn't blink. It didn't sleep. And tonight, it saw everything. 3 hours earlier, 370 Japanese aircraft had taken off from carriers Taihu, Shakaku, and Zuikaku, bound for the American fleet. They flew in tight formation, guided by dead reckoning and faith, across hundreds of miles of open water. Their plan, strike first, crush the U.S. carriers, and save the Empire's last chance at controlling the Pacific. But the Americans were no longer fighting blind. By 1944, every major U.S. carrier group was equipped with airborne early warning and surface radar, connected through a growing network of combat information centers. For the first time in naval history, a fleet could see an enemy long before the enemy even knew they were there. On the radar screens, the Japanese air groups appeared as flickering clusters, invisible to the eye, yet as clear as day to the machines. "Interceptors ready?" asked Captain Stump. Commander John Jimmy Thatch, the air group leader aboard Lexington, nodded. "We'll meet them at 100 miles. The radar men adjusted their dials. The blips on the screen inched closer. Across the fleet, squadrons of F-6F Hellcats roared to life, their engines thundering like rolling surf. Deck crews waved them off one by one, launching into the darkness. Above the ocean, the night split with flame as American fighters climbed into the stars, guided not by searchlights, but by the invisible hand of radar. "God help them," muttered a signalman, watching the streaks vanish into the clouds. "They don't even know what's waiting." Far to the west, aboard the carrier Taihu, the Japanese pilots had no such instruments. Their radio direction finders flickered with static. Compass needles quivered. They flew in formation by instinct, scanning the horizon for a fleet that radar had already marked for death. Americans blind without the sun, their instructor had told them. Strike fast and they'll never see you coming. They didn't know that in 1944, darkness belonged to the Americans. As the Japanese strike groups crossed the 150-mile mark, a voice cut through the CIC aboard Lexington. "Contact confirmed, 30,000 feet. Inbound fast." Captain Stump turned to his radar chief. "Give them the full picture." McCauley grinned faintly, tapping the console. "They'll never make it past our screen, sir." "We'll vector the Hellcats right to them." Stump nodded. "Do it." "And Godspeed." Moments later, the first intercept orders went out, relayed from radar stations to fighter controllers, from fighter controllers to the pilots already cutting through the black sky. Above the ocean, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was about to begin, not with eyes, but with signals. The Japanese still laughed at radar. In less than an hour, they would stop laughing forever. November 1935. Boeing Engineering Office, Seattle, Washington. Rain drummed softly against the hangar windows as Eddie Allen spread blueprints across his desk. The Model 299 was gone, reduced to ashes and a cautionary tale. But in his mind, it still flew, every control cable, every switch, every piece of wiring, alive in his memory. He wasn't thinking about the crash anymore. He was thinking about what had caused it. Two of the best aviators in America, trained, disciplined, confident, had simply forgotten to disengage the gust locks. That's all. It wasn't arrogance or negligence. It was human limitation. The Model 299 was unlike any plane before it. With 4 engines, hydraulic systems, retractable landing gear, flaps, and complex electrical circuits, it demanded a dozen separate steps before takeoff, too many to rely on memory alone. Allen muttered to himself, "A pilot's brain isn't built to remember 20 things in perfect order. But a piece of paper can." He tore a page from his notebook and began scribbling. 2 weeks later, inside a drafty hangar at Boeing Field, a small group of engineers and Army test pilots gathered around a folding table. The air smelled of oil, coffee, and frustration. At the head of the table, Eddie Allen held up a thin clipboard with a few handwritten lines. "This," he said quietly, "is the solution." One pilot leaned back skeptically. "What's that supposed to be, a manual?" Allen shook his head. "Not a manual. A checklist." He placed it on the table. The first line read, "Before takeoff, elevator controls, unlocked. Mixture, rich. Propellers, set. Altimeter, adjusted. Fuel valves, open." The room was silent. "Gentlemen," Allen continued, "we can't make airplanes simpler anymore. But we can make pilots smarter by giving them a tool that thinks when they can't afford to forget." The first test came a week later. A new Model 299 prototype, repainted, and renamed Y1B17, stood on the runway, gleaming beneath a slate-gray sky. 2 test pilots climbed aboard, clipboard in hand. For the first time in aviation history, before every step, one pilot would read and the other would respond. Mixture? Rich? Propellers? Set. Gust locks? Unlocked. Engines roared to life. The Y1B17 rolled down the runway, lifted off, smooth, steady, controlled. The Boeing engineers held their breath. And this time, the plane kept climbing. She circled overhead for half an hour, her 4 engines humming in perfect harmony, then touched down flawlessly. When the pilots stepped out, grinning, one of them handed the clipboard back to Allen. "Well, Eddie," he said, "your little list just saved us from another funeral." Word spread fast. The Army engineers, skeptical at first, now requested copies. Soon, laminated cards appeared in every cockpit: takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, landing, each broken into precise foolproof steps. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't mechanical. But it worked. The checklist turned the B-17 from a too-complex-to-fly experiment into a reliable war machine. Over the next 2 years, test pilots logged over 1.8 million miles without a major incident. Boeing regained its contract. Production resumed. By 1941, the B-17, now officially designated the Flying Fortress, rolled off assembly lines by the hundreds. And with each new bomber, a simple sheet of paper sat inside the cockpit, a civilian's idea that had become sacred. In time, that idea spread beyond Boeing, beyond the Air Corps. Every aircraft manufacturer, Douglas, Lockheed, North American, adopted it. The checklist became a ritual, a doctrine of discipline written in ink. But for Eddie Allen, it was never about procedure. It was about trusting the system more than the ego. He once told a colleague, "Pilots like to think they're infallible. But in this machine age, one forgotten lever can end a war before it starts." He was right, and soon, that philosophy would save not just airplanes, but thousands of men. Because the Flying Fortress was about to go to war. August 17, 1942, Rouen, France. Engines thundered across the English sky as 12 B-17 Flying Fortresses from the 97th Bomb Group roared eastward toward enemy territory. It was the first daylight bombing raid of the war, a direct strike into Nazi-occupied Europe. Inside one of the bombers, Lieutenant Paul Tibbets, just 27 years old, sat at the controls. Sweat trickled down his neck despite the freezing altitude. He glanced at his co-pilot. "Checklist," the co-pilot nodded, pulling a laminated sheet from the dashboard. "Flaps, set. Mixture, rich. Fuel, balanced. Bomb bay doors, ready." Each confirmation came like the ticking of a clock. In a cockpit filled with the roar of engines, it was the one sound that meant control. Tibbets gave a thumbs up. "All right, boys. Let's make history." Below them stretched a continent at war, rivers of steel, smoke, and fire. The B-17s flew tight formation, silver giants cutting through the cold. Their bomb loads were small by later standards, but the symbolism was enormous. Every man aboard knew this flight was the real test, not just of a bomber, but of an idea. Could precision, procedure, and discipline triumph over chaos? At 25,000 feet, German flak began to rise, black blossoms of death exploding around the formation. "Flak, 3 o'clock high," shouted the tail gunner. Tibbets kept steady hands on the yoke. Every movement was deliberate, not instinct, not luck. The Fortress flew exactly as it was designed to, step by step, command by command. The bombardier called out targets. "Rouen marshalling yards in sight. Doors open. Bombs away." The plane lurched slightly as the payload dropped. A moment later, distant flashes rippled across the ground. The first American bombs to strike Europe in daylight. They turned for home. One Fortress had taken shrapnel, but all 12 made it back. When they landed in England, a crowd of ground crew and officers ran to the tarmac, cheering. Reporters scribbled. Photographers snapped shots of the men stepping out of their aircraft, exhausted but alive. General Isaiah Aker, commander of the 8th Air Force, watched from the sidelines and whispered, "That was no miracle. That was discipline." In the following months, the B-17 would become a legend, the Flying Fortress in truth as much as name. Its 4 engines carried it through storms of flak and fighters. Its armor shrugged off bullets. Crews swore it could fly home on one wing, limping back across the channel with holes you could crawl through. But none of that mattered without the human order that kept it alive, the system born from Eddie Allen's piece of paper. Every takeoff, every bombing run, every landing began the same way. A voice in the cockpit, reading line after line. A ritual against disaster. A reminder that even in war, memory fails, but procedure endures. By 1944, as waves of B-17s blackened the skies over Germany, the Army Air Forces trained thousands of new pilots each month. Many were barely out of school, too young to green, too terrified, but they had their checklists. One flight instructor put it simply to a recruit at Passingbourn, "You're not just flying this plane. You're flying everyone who learned before you. That list in your hand, that's their experience written down. Don't ignore it." That doctrine, the humble checklist, didn't just save the B-17 program, it saved the Allied Air War. And it saved Eddie Allen himself, at least for a while. February 18, 1943, Seattle, Washington. In the vast hangar of Boeing Field, Eddie Allen stood beside a line of new B-17Fs, their aluminum skins gleaming under the floodlights. The production floor echoed with hammers, drills, and the smell of hot oil. He had come full circle, from the wreckage of 1935 to the heart of America's war machine. The Flying Fortress was no longer an experiment. It was the backbone of the Allied bombing campaign. But there was one more aircraft to test, the B-29 Superfortress, Boeing's newest and most ambitious bomber, a technological marvel, and far more dangerous to fly. Allen insisted on personally overseeing the test flights. If we're asking young men to trust our machines, he said, we'd better trust them first. On February 18, 1943, he climbed into the cockpit of a B-29 prototype for a routine engine test. It never returned. An engine fire spread to the fuel tanks. The aircraft went down in flames, killing Allen and 10 others. The nation mourned quietly, one engineer among thousands lost to war. But those who knew him understood the truth. The very system he had built ensured no mistake like his would ever happen again. 1945, over Germany. A formation of B-17s crossed the Rhine, sunlight glinting off their wings. Inside one cockpit, a young pilot checked the list taped to his yoke. Faded, oil stain, edges curled from use. Mixture? Rich? Fuel? Set? Flaps? Down, he smiled faintly. Thanks, Eddie, he murmured. Outside, the war thundered on. But inside the fortress, every step, every breath, every movement was ordered, remembered, controlled. The checklist, a simple civilian idea born from tragedy, had saved a bomber, saved lives, and shaped aviation forever. To this day, every pilot, from the smallest Cessna to the largest jetliner, repeats that same ritual, words spoken in every cockpit on Earth, a legacy written in ink and discipline. Because when the world forgets, the checklist remembers.